Hello and welcome to Pamphlet Global. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visits to Europe and United Arab Emirates are being viewed as much more than routine diplomatic outreach. At a time when the Middle East remains unstable and the Russian-Ukraine war is continuing, the disruption in global commodity flows, these visits are increasingly tied to a larger Indian concern of energy security, fertilizer supplies, and the economic stability of the Indian agriculture. What looks like diplomacy on the surface is also a strategic effort to basically shield India from volatile global LNG and ammonia market that has become deeply entangled with war. Sanctions imposed earlier during the Russia-Ukraine war has now consequences that can potentially affect the Indian farms, fertilizer subsidies, and rural inflation. India's energy and fertilizer security is now directly linked to the geopolitics in a way we have never seen before. Every escalation in West Asia or every disruption that is happening in Strait of Hormuz and every sanction imposed during the Russia-Ukraine war has now consequences that eventually will reach the Indian farms, fertilizer subsidies, and the rural inflation. That is why PM Modi's visit to Europe and UAE, especially to Norway and UAE, matters strategically. UAE remains central to India's long-term energy architecture. Along with Qatar, it is one of the critical suppliers that supports Indian LNG requirements. And LNG today is just not an energy issue because it is directly connected to the fertilizer production, because natural gas is the key feedstock used to manufacture ammonia, which in turn is essential for urea and other fertilizers. This means rising gas prices eventually translate into higher agricultural input costs globally as well as domestically. The concern has intensified after renewed conflict in West Asia, disrupting shipping flows and creating flares around Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy choke points at the moment in the world. According to international energy estimates, nearly 1/5 of global LNG supply faced disruption after the March escalation in the West Asia region. That immediately has pushed the gas prices higher both across Europe and Asia. Obviously the ripple effect has also moved to the fertilizer markets very quickly. The Russia-Ukraine war had already damaged global fertilizer supply chains by affecting the Black Sea logistics, raising European gas prices and disrupting Russian exports. Now, instability in the Gulf has had another layer added of uncertainty because Gulf LNG and ammonia production are both vulnerable to conflict and shipping disruptions, which we are seeing in the Strait of Hormuz. Against this backdrop, India appears to be preparing for a longer period of global supply instability rather than assuming the crisis is going to end quickly. That explains the sequencing of Prime Minister's diplomacy as well. The UAE visit helps reinforce India's crucial energy relationship at a time of regional instability. The Norway visit, meanwhile, has significance beyond Europe because Norway is emerging as an increasingly important energy and ammonia player. One company in particular stands out there, which is Yara International. Yara is one of the world's biggest ammonia traders with extensive shipping, storage, and terminal infrastructure. In a world where ammonia markets are under pressure from war and supply shocks, access to stable ammonia trade networks becomes extremely strategically important for food security itself. Norway also matters because Europe is increasingly depending on Norwegian gas to reduce the reliance on Russian energy. Now, that is where India's engagement with Oslo is now connected not just to trade diplomacy but also for future LNG and ammonia diversification. What is notable is that India entered this crisis phase better prepared than anyone expected and that many expected. Ahead of 2026 Kharif season, the government aggressively moved to increase fertilizer availability, accelerating imports and expanding subsidy support. Fertilizer stocks reportedly rose significantly above last year levels while the government absorbed higher international costs instead of transferring them to the burden directly to the farmers. This becomes important because India's fertilizer system remains heavily dependent on imported LNG, imported ammonia, and imported phosphatic inputs. Despite global disruption, India has so far managed to avoid a severe domestic supply crunch. Another key move was diversification in the policy. And when Gulf disruptions initially affected the LNG flows, India reportedly increased procurement from countries such as Oman, UAE, Nigeria, and even Angola. The diversification has helped reduce immediate pressure after supplies from parts of the Gulf became very uncertain, and the vulnerabilities remain substantial. More than half of India's LNG imports have traditionally moved through the Strait of Hormuz. Even if India diversifies, alternative cargoes are usually expensive, as shipping routes are longer and spare global LNG capacity still remains limited. And there is another major variable in this story, and that is China. Now, China is rapidly emerging as a dominant force in the future ammonia economy, especially in green ammonia production. Unlike Western producers that depend mainly on natural gas, most Chinese ammonia production is coal-based. But Beijing is now investing heavily in renewable hydrogen-linked ammonia as a part of its long-term industrial and energy strategy. By 2028, China is expected to dominate the global renewable ammonia capacity expansion. For India, this creates both an opportunity as well as a risk, because on one hand, the cheaper Chinese green ammonia technologies could benefit energy marketings or emerging marketings. On the other hand, excessive Chinese control over future low-carbon ammonia supply chains could create another strategic dependency similar to what the world had already witnessed in solar manufacturing and rare earth supply chains. The larger challenge for India today is that every major power bloc is now competing for the same energy resources, and Europe is still racing to refill its gas inventories before the winter sets in. The US is expanding its role as a major LNG supplier. Russia is still redirecting energy towards China under increasingly asymmetrical arrangements. Now, Gulf energy remains indispensable despite global and regional instability. At the same time, Russian ammonia infrastructure has also come under repeated pressure during the Ukraine conflict. While Gulf production remains, facilities remain exposed to drone attacks, missile strikes, and shipping disruptions, which we saw when the war was on between the US and Iran. This means that the global ammonia market has very little room left for additional shocks. And that is why fertilizers are no longer merely an agricultural issue. They are now part of a strategic diplomacy. India today has to balance relationships simultaneously with the Gulf monarchies, Russia and Europe and the United States, while ensuring it does not become overly dependent on any one geopolitical bloc for critical energy and fertilizer supplies. The immediate outlook for India remains manageable, but policymakers clearly understand that if the wars in West Asia and Ukraine continue to prolong conflicts of attrition, LNG and ammonia markets could tighten further, and subsidy pressures could rise sharply, and maintaining agricultural stability could become far more expensive in the years coming ahead. Thank you.